So welcome everybody to our morning/afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're in, webinar on mastering Teams' first IAM governance. Let me just get my screens organized here, and we will jump right in. Okay, my name is Peter Carson. If you're not familiar with me, I'm a president, founder of Envision IT, one of the speakers for the session here today, also a 14 times Microsoft MVP and speak at a lot of conferences and such. All our contact details are up here. We're recording the session. We're also going to be providing the slide decks afterwards. So any links that you see in here and such will be provided out to the group from there. Beatrice, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah. So Beatriz Oliveira, I'm the founder and CEO of BindTuning. I've been a Microsoft Regional Director for the past 6 years. And I'm working in technology for about 25 years now and very happy to be here.
Thanks, Beatrice. And Carlos?
So hello, everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on the space where you are right now. So my name is Carlos Silva. So I'm the BindTuning CTO. So a company dedicated to empower organization to building modern and engaging digital workspace. So over the last 10 years, so I had the privilege to be speaking in numbers of industry events around the world and contributing to the Microsoft 365 community, not only as a technologist, but also as an event organizer. So trying to bring in professionals together to share acknowledgement, drive innovation, and shape the future. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today.
Thanks, Carlos. So a little background on the companies. I'll take the Envision IT side. Beatrice will take BindTuning. Envision IT has been around longer than I like to admit, a fair bit of gray in the beard, but our guiding light is we make Microsoft simple, which we know we can never achieve, but it's still a good goal to aspire to from that point of view. We're both a SaaS products company, so we have tools around our tenant dashboard, our extranet user manager, people search. We're going to touch a bit on the today, as well as consulting services around M365, Azure, and AI. And Beatrice, if you want to take the BindTuning side.
Sure. So BindTuning, we're all about empowering organizations to basically manage Microsoft 365. We provide easy governance and provisioning capabilities. We're in the market since 2012. We have been serving customers all over the world across multiple industries. And we are also a modern work designated partner with an advanced specialization in adoption and change management. And today we will be we'll be talking a little bit about our core product, Automate 365.
Cool, thanks. So Beatrice, you and I have known each other for quite a while through the MVP community. We actually belong to a CEO group of like-minded Microsoft partner companies. I guess we started partnering together about 2 years ago, but it wasn't really till later last year that we really got our two products fitting together. So happy to be doing our first joint webinar together, and let's dive into things. But
yeah,
I do want to, yes, I do want to preface. We did a Vision IT webinar. This would have been 2 months ago, I think it was, called Spring Clean Your Tenant, and it was really about decluttering and optimizing your environment. It's kind of a precursor to this one here. So if you didn't get a chance to check it out, go to our event page. The recording's there, the deck is there from that point of view. There was a good case study with the city of Greater Sudbury around this and around the information architecture that we built out for them as part of that. We won't have time today to go into that one, but we are going to share some other case studies towards the end of this session. I wanted to start with, a little tongue-in-cheek here, the impact of a Teams last approach to information architecture, which is not our recommendation. The reality is that Teams got rolled out in a lot of organizations through COVID. Maybe wasn't well managed. You kind of had to do what you had to do, and good on everybody for getting remote going in a very short order of time and such from there. But we see a lot of information sprawl, broken collaboration, overspend because you're, exceeding tenant thresholds from storage and things like that. Lots of challenges around security and governance, particularly as people are starting to light up Copilot and getting ready for that, realizing that they need to do more work from that point of view. Just productivity, if things are confusing, it's hard for people to get their work done, and chaos and IT bottlenecks becoming part of that. So that's sort of unfortunately, the reality for a lot of organizations. And we're actually not any different. I'm going to use our own company as an example here, and we have a lot of these things here, and we're sort of going through this same journey ourselves as we're taking clients through it as well. So some key takeaways for the webinar as a whole, Teams is a mess in most organizations. Let's just accept that. We rarely see a well-organized team when we come in with a client, but our goal is to help them with that. And cleaning it up and keeping it that way does feel overwhelming when you've got literally thousands of teams in an organization like Sudbury had. It does feel like you could just never achieve this, but it actually can be done. It took about a year with City of Sudbury to go through that process, but with proper planning, process, and tools, it is achievable not only to do it, but to actually keep it that way going forward. And you'll definitely get a productivity boost coming out of that. But maybe less visible, but equally important is security and information protection, co-pilot readiness are all benefits that are going to come out as part of that as well. So in terms of what we're going to go through here today, the first part is going to be very slide heavy. We're going to talk about Teams architecture, sort of what's the core architecture that you should be aware of as you're building your own information architecture for your organization. Talking about some governance strategy, how you actually implement this, and some tools for success from that point of view. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. I may not see them as we're going through, but Kevin and others on the Envision IT team are kind of keeping an eye on chat and can raise as appropriate if we want to stop and answer those as we go through. If we don't get a chance to, we'll definitely follow up post and go through it from that point of view. So this term information architecture, what it's about is saying, hey, how do we organize our content in Microsoft 365? It's a term that was very common in the SharePoint days, going way back into the early 2000s when SharePoint first started becoming prevalent in the Microsoft ecosystem. But really, how do we organize the content in a way that's easy to find and use? And that's a tough challenge. I mean, if you think back to the days that people organized content in file shares and they had these deep nested folders, it typically made sense to the person that organized it and often made no sense to everybody else. You kind of want to figure out something that's not too complex and easy to understand for everybody in there. And how do we align that with the business, provide a consistent user experience, and facilitate that collaboration and communication? Because Teams is the place, yes, where you chat and have conversations, but it's also the place that you collaborate. It's very tied with SharePoint under the hood as a document collaboration place. This next slide is a little tongue-in-cheek as well. It's kind of poking fun at why Teams group chat is such a mess and how you really need to move towards channel conversations and how a good information architecture can help support that. And it's funny because if you're reading through, you see John and Samantha are having this deep conversation about budget reports and quarters and meetings and such, and they get mad at this poor guy, Mike, that interjects in the middle, says, hey, I'm looking for my coffee mug. His conversation is actually the one that belongs in the group chat. The one about the budget report and quarter tracking and everything else, that should be in a channel. I don't know if this is the finance team or the operations team, but that one should be properly organized. Having these interleaved conversations in chat is a confusing mess. So if we think about Teams and SharePoint together and sort of differentiating those different styles of conversations and documents, it's important to understand kind of what's under the hood and how that hangs together. So, everybody I'm assuming is familiar with Teams chat. Some organizations are more mature than others on channel conversations to say, hey, we have specific teams with specific channels, and we can have proper threaded conversations that don't interleave different topics together. It's a much better way of working. And it's something that I encourage a lot in Envision IT. We do a lot with, not to say we still don't have a ton of chat conversations, we do, but trying to drive that way and having an information architecture that supports that is important to empowering that. Because anything you do in chat, if you're attaching documents to a chat, like that budget report that was being talked about, that ends up in somebody's OneDrive. Private by default, it's going to set up sharing as part of that chat conversation, and that becomes part of the big problem of oversharing and security and everything else. Not to mention, OneDrive is not the place for your critical business documents to live. You really want them to be in SharePoint. They should be in team sites from there, which is what happens underneath channel conversations. When I create a team and a channel, it's creating a SharePoint team site underneath that, and that's where your content gets shared from that point of view. So it's an important distinction as you're doing your architecture to say, hey, how are we going to set up our teams and channels? And that's how we're going to organize our documents underneath, because they're very connected and joined at the hip from that point of view. There's also communication sites in Teams or in SharePoint that aren't part of Teams. we're going to kind of leave those. We're going to focus more on the collaboration and the team side of things. So you may or may not be familiar with SharePoint Online. It is the document repository underneath Teams. It's nice because we like to talk about a single version of the truth. We don't have multiple documents scattered in different places and different names on them, version 1, draft 2, final, all that kind of craziness. No, we can use version history in SharePoint, properly organize things and keep content together from that perspective. SharePoint's really a platform. You can do a lot with it. It's not just a document repository. You've got lists and forms and workflows and metadata and hub sites and all these other things that, if you're really getting into your team's architecture, you're going to want to understand and dive into that. We don't have time today to go too deep on it, but I just wanted to touch on it from that perspective. What I really wanted to go deeper on, and this can be a confusing topic, is in Teams, there's this concept of channels, and channels can be one of 3 types. They can be a standard channel, a private channel, or a shared channel. And important distinctions as you decide around this as to what this looks like. So as standard channel, basically, if you've got 20 people in your team, let's say it's our marketing team, and I create a channel in that marketing team for webinars. And we literally have a channel in our marketing team called webinars. Everybody who's in the marketing team gets to see that channel because it's the standard channel and the membership is the same as the team. I could say, you know what, I want to have a private channel that's a subset. In our operations team, we have a finance private channel, which is a smaller group than the whole company, should be part of those finance conversations. So it's a subset of the team members. Or a shared channel, similar to a private channel, but you can have members from outside the team as well as within the team as part of that. The challenge is what happens under the hood, what gets created. Well, sometimes you get folders in SharePoint as part of standard channels, but private channels and shared channels create their own site collections. And I've got a diagram a little later that sort of reiterates this point and explains from that point of view. The other super important point is we do a lot of sharing. I mean, our Extranet User Manager product is all about sharing at scale with people outside of your organization. And it's built on top of a concept called B2B guests. When I create a sharing link in Teams or in SharePoint, that is using the B2B guest structure underneath the hood from Microsoft to do that. Whereas a shared channel is different. It uses what's called B2B Direct Connect. And this requires sort of setup between the 2 organizations to become part of that shared channel. It's sort of a higher bar. You need IT from both sides involved to do that. And you can't actually bring B2B guests into a shared channel. So it's a challenge for us. Most of our clients, we haven't been able to get shared channels set up. So we use standard channels from that point of view, just so we can bring them in as B2B guests. So if we look at sort of a Venn diagram view of what I just explained there, we've got a team and we can have a large set of members of that team. A shared channel is just the same as the team itself. A private channel is a subset of the people that's in the overall team, and it can't contain anybody who's not in the outside team. So if you have, let's say that operations finance private channel that I was talking about, I want to bring in somebody who's not part of operations into that private channel. I can't do that because they have to belong to the parent team as part of that. If I create it as a shared channel, I can still make it a subset of the people, but I could bring in other teams or other people into that shared channel as well. That could be both internal and external users. The external is a little tougher in terms of how you invite those people in. So diving a little deeper into that external scenario, that question between B2B guests and B2B Direct Connect, because if you're going to be doing any sort of sharing out of this information architecture that you're building, you really need to understand this part and say, hey, which type of people can we bring in as part of that? B2B guests is easy. You can invite anybody in. They don't even have to have a Microsoft account. They'll get a one-time passcode when they go to sign in. Microsoft emails them a code. They type it into the password box and they're in. It's super easy. So it works really well from a collaboration point of view. It doesn't actually work as well from a Teams point of view, because if I invite, say, Beatrice and Carlo into our team as guests, yes, they can see the conversations that are happening in there, but they actually need to switch their teams to be the Envision IT teams instead of the BindTuning teams. And they lose visibility to everything that's happening in their company so they can communicate with us in our company. That's not an ideal situation. I belong to a lot of teams and I don't see what's happening in most of them because I'm not going to cycle through all those teams and look at the activities. B2B Direct Connect solves that, says, hey, it's easy for people, for other organizations to come in, but it's tough to get them set up. In fact, Carlos, when did we start trying to get a shared channel going? It was over a year ago, wasn't it? It's been a while. So,
yeah.
I mean, Carlos is a global admin in the BindTuning tenant. I'm a global admin in ours. We have all the rights to do this, and we still haven't managed to get it working. And it's I don't think it's Carlos' fault or my fault. It's just doesn't always work the way you want on the Microsoft side. In fact, this is our shared channel screenshot here. I don't know, Carlos, if you ever got this note from me from back in December. I meant to follow up to see that, hey, I actually got the shared channel to work. I got Carlos invited into it, but I can't add Beatrice or anybody else from BindTuning. It says, hey, there's an error in admin policy. I don't think it is actually an admin policy. Something's just broken, some of the shared channel stuff. When it works, it's awesome, but it just doesn't always work well from that perspective. So I used to be a big fan of shared channels from an external sharing point of view. I've kind of backed off on that now and said, hey, you know what? B2B guest just works better from that point of view. And that's had a big bearing on how we do our own team's information architecture. We were setting up shared channels for each partner and for each client that we can communicate with them. And we've got a couple of clients and partners that it's working really well with. But as I said, the majority, we haven't been able to get things set up on their side and actually use it. We're switching back and saying, hey, let's just create shared channels standard channels, and we'll use email for communication. That's fine. As much as I love Teams over email for communication, sometimes it's easier just to use email. So this diagram kind of distills down what I just described in terms of what actually gets built under the hood by Microsoft when you create a team or when you create a channel. So when you create your initial team, it's creating what's called a Microsoft 365 group under the hood of that team. And that has a shared mailbox. So there's actually an email alias. You can send email to that shared mailbox. It doesn't integrate to Teams, but you can still use it as a shared email collaboration spot from that point of view. And it creates a site collection in SharePoint with document libraries. And as you create standard channels, they just create folders in this document library. So it's pretty clean architecture from that point of view. Where it gets a little more complicated is if you start building shared or private channels, each of those channels actually creates their own site collection. So if I've got a team, that has 10 shared channels in it, I actually end up with a site collection for the main team itself, plus another 10 site collections, one for each channel from there. So it can start to sprawl and add complexity from that point of view. There's a OneNote for the main team, but there actually ends up being OneNotes in these site collections as well. As part of that, there's actually a group and enter ID that ties all the members and the owners together as part of that as well. So there's a fair bit happening under the hood that you should be aware of as you're building your information architecture that Microsoft is doing as you're provisioning this out. And something that's top of mind for a lot of people right now is security. And what's driving that is Copilot, to say, hey, we want to get ready for Copilot, but we're worried about oversharing and sensitivity and things like that, and Copilot exposing some of the gaps in our tenant. So building your architecture so that oversharing doesn't tend to happen is a great way to get ready from a Copilot readiness point of view. Another thing you should think of as you're doing your information architecture is what's the sensitivity of the content that we're putting in these different teams and channels and SharePoint sites as part of that. Is it low, medium, high? We like using what we call the traffic light protocol that the UK government developed that has a green, amber, red sensitivity, red being highly sensitive. Because what Copilot will do is it'll respect those labels to say, hey, I just hoovered up a bunch of highly sensitive content to create your PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to tell you that presentation is sensitive and you shouldn't be using it for a public webinar like this as part of that. So as you're thinking about your information architecture, think about your sensitivity labels. We haven't seen most organizations implement this, and it's actually not a ton of work. Using something like the traffic light protocol, just defining a set of labels. Can things be externally shared? Do you require multi-factor authentication when people come in to share that? Do you require those documents to be encrypted if they're high sensitivity? What sort of licensing do you need as part of that? I used to say you needed E5 to get up to this sort of red strict encrypted document levels, but with some changes recently in Microsoft licensing, it's actually easier to do this even with an E3 license. And we see a lot of our clients are licensed at the E3 or the E5 level. but they really haven't done anything from this perspective. So this is a good time as you're planning that information architecture out, is to think about that sensitivity as part of that. So at the end of all of this, really, the question you're trying to answer is, as I look at my organization, what does a team and a channel in Microsoft 365 represent from my organization? And it can be different for every organization. For us, we're a software vendor and we're a consulting company. We have partners like BindTuning. We have lots of clients. When we first started our Teams IA, probably 5-6 years ago, it's actually before COVID, we had rolled Teams out. We decided we were going to create a team for every client and a channel for every project. And that kind of blew up. We ended up having hundreds of teams in our Teams tenant, and we're only 22 staff. So it was way out of whack in terms of number of teams to number of people. So we're going through a new architecture process where we're saying, hey, we're going to create one client team, which we've done, and we're going to create channels for every client in that team. So we kind of collapsed the structure down and kept it simpler from that point of view. We're still going to create a site collection for every client, even though it's a channel, but that works well from that point of view. And I'll show you a bit of what that looks like in our environment a little later through here. So, as we talk to clients, we trying to understand, what is their business? What do they do? Do they run a lot of projects? And that should be represented as part of the Teams IA. Do you have department level teams? That's a pretty common theme in most organizations. But what's special about what that org does, and how should your team structure represent that particular nature of the business? So that's not an easy question to answer, but assuming that you've done that and you've started to build out your IA, what does the steps actually look like? What's the process that we need to go through as we build out a Teams first information architecture? So kind of 3 main steps and then one common one across the whole thing. Communication and change management is important right from the beginning of this process to the end, because you are going to be restructuring things. You may be doing things like a file share migration or an on-premises SharePoint migration as part of this project as well. And you got to tell people what's happening and when are you getting to their stuff and what is it going to mean to them? Is there going to be downtime, or is it just going to be a seamless transition and things will magically be in the new structure for them? But it starts with building that information architecture and planning that migration. And as I said, it might be from a legacy on-premises infrastructure, or it might actually be a migration in the cloud. That City of Sudbury scenario that I took people through in the previous webinar was already in Microsoft 365. It's just they had, across 1,500 staff, they had about the same number of teams and a lot more channels as part of that. It had gotten way out of control. So it's a matter of targeting, which teams belong to which departments, which needed to stay, which need to be consolidated, what should be deleted, and building a migration plan around that. And then going department by department to say, hey, we're going to build this new information architecture, provision those teams, and migrate this content across. And there may be some changes involved in that. We might be doing a weekend migration of this particular department. We're going to tell them, hey, on Friday, make sure you don't leave anything open, and come in Monday morning, make sure the new looks right, and that's where you start working from there. So we want to try and minimize the impact of the business from that point of view as we get into this migration piece here, and ultimately cleaning up those existing teams through that. So the information gathering, we like using a tool called MindJet. We used it for years. We used it back in the SharePoint information architecture days as well, just to kind of map out what's the structure. We've got some business lines, we've got our internet, there's departments, work groups, projects. Again, this will be different for different organizations, and what channels and libraries and even folder structure is going to be underneath that. So this is a high-level planning exercise. You want to involve stakeholders from across the organization as part of this. You're probably going to go through multiple iterations of it. One of the things I like about MindJet is you can actually do it live. You can say, hey, let's get the tool up on the big screen in the boardroom, or we get a Teams virtual session going as part of it. And let's actually have the discussion and move the boxes around and build it out. And then, clean it up after the session, distribute it out to the group, get some feedback, maybe do 1 or 2 more of those sessions and say, okay, now we've got an information architecture together. The other thing that's important to do is to understand what's in your tenant. And late last year, we launched what we call our M365 tenant dashboard. This is an important tool as part of that process. It's not the only tool. There's other vendor tools. There's, to a certain degree, some reporting available from Microsoft. Arguably, it doesn't go deep enough for what we want here. But really understanding what we call workspaces in your tenant, which could be a team site, a site collection in SharePoint, what have you. What different types of workspaces are there, and how active versus inactive are they? And we find, this red bar, which hasn't been touched in over a year, is typically the biggest piece of the pie in most organizations. There's a lot of stale content in most people's tenants. So how do you clean that up? Do you have a retention requirement from a legal compliance point of view? Do you need to put retention labels in as part of that? How far have you gone in applying sensitivity labels, sharing links and sharing set up in there, from an oversharing point of view? What does that look like? How much storage are we using? So this becomes a guiding light to say, hey, let's understand what we have today and where we want to be, and then we can start to build that plan across from there. And ultimately, consolidating those findings, and also thinking about that security point of view. Back to my co-pilot and oversharing concept, understanding who belongs to each of these teams and how do you structure that. Can you do things like dynamic groups and Enter ID, which are a nice way of managing memberships, rather than individually putting people and taking people out of all these different groups to define access? You can build rules to say, hey, if your department says this, I'm going to put you in this team. And as you onboard and offboard people, it just magically happens as part of that. Or maybe you can leverage stuff in your HRIS to drive that. You really need to think about your onboarding, cross-boarding, offboarding processes as part of that. And your external users as well. How are you doing access there? What does that look like from that point of view? Getting into your migration planning, the inventory that I talked about, deploying the architecture, the communications around that. And it's not typically a do all in one fell swoop for your entire tenant. It's just too much change for the organization. So it becomes a sort of a circular path where we inventory and plan, maybe department by department. We map out in Excel often, build out those team sites, do the migrations, do some QA around that, launch it, move on to the next one. It feels like it's a lot of spins around the circle, but it's kind of the only practical way to get through it from that point of view. So let's take a minute here and talk about Envision IT. I've mentioned that we have clients, we have partners, we have vendors, we have a particular team structure. In fact, if I pull in my my teams here as an example, let's have a look here. So we can see we have sort of department level teams that have different channels within there for different products and aspects of the development that we do. But then we have our clients channel here. So in the past, we would have created teams for each of these clients, and my team's sidebar just got out of control from that point of view. I like having the channels for here because I can actually pin them to say, hey, maybe this is a client that I use that I'm doing a lot of work with. I can say, hey, let's just pin that particular channel and have it at the top of my teams from that point of view. So that works well from an organization point of view. We've got our partner portal. We can see BindTuning in there. That little icon there means that's the shared channel. That's one that we're trying to get going between Carlos and myself. And we've got other, our marketing and conferences and webinars and such are all in here from that point of view. So having these conversations in here makes it very easy to have that structured conversations. Oh, and Teams is not loading. We'll flip out of that from that point of view. So let's have a look now at, what are we trying to build and what does that actually look like? So one of our big goals, we use our External User Manager product to build a customer partner portal. So this is actually BindTuning's page in our partner portal that they have access to. So we can see actually that Beatrice and Carlos and a couple of other folks from BindTuning plus our team all have access into here. And there's a link to the actual event folder for the webinar that we're doing now. So we have access to the PowerPoint presentation. We can work together from that point of view. But behind the scenes, this is actually just a Microsoft 365 group in SharePoint Online. So I can come to that group site here, and this is what you would expect to see from a Teams point of view. So I can see the activity. We've got a bunch of agreements that we're working on. We can see those same people because we're sharing the same membership across both of those. We're using Enter ID under the hood from that point of view. And as I come down into the documents library in this particular site, SharePoint Online has a weird bug here. I got to refresh. There we go. So we have a particular folder structure. It's actually fairly similar between partners and customers. So things like our legal agreements that we work on, we've got a folder for that. We've got a private documents here that we do slightly different permissions on. So Carlos and Beatrice don't see that. That's sort of our private area to work within there. But everything else we share with our partners. We do the same with our clients. We're very open from that perspective. We need to build a lot of these sites, and building them by hand and setting up all the permissions and folders properly is just prone to error. Like, we're going to mess things up from that point of view. So we've actually built integrations between our extranet user manager product that's building the portal and BindTuning's Automate 365. So when we're in our SharePoint, I can actually go to our SharePoint and say, I want to create a site, but rather than using one of the Microsoft templates, I can actually use from BindTuning. And we've actually gone through a template process to create a standard template that we want to use for a partner site, a vendor site, and a client site. And they each have slight nuances to their information architecture, but it's nice because I pick that, it maybe goes through an approval process and then it automates and builds that out from there. So Beatrice, why don't I turn it over to you? Tell us a bit more about the Automate 365 tool.
Sure. So as I mentioned in the beginning, BindTuning helps organizations manage Microsoft 365 tenants to fight situations and fix situations like the ones you've just described. All of this with governance and provisioning capabilities. So things like what you just mentioned, structure and content, sensitivity labels, retention labels, how do you set the right guardrails, the right rules, how do you manage external sharing and guest access? All of these very much based on the concept of templates. That's exactly what we provide. So Automate 365 helps you take governance to the next level. It's really a powerful governance and provisioning platform built on top of Microsoft 365 to simplify all your business processes. Our goal is really to free up your teams, help you get more time to do the things that matter the most, and ultimately contribute to your success. And I think that Carlos is going to guide us through some of our core features.
Thanks, Beatrice. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we need to level up the Microsoft 365 game. So by simplify daily challenges, by empower teams and stay ahead of what coming next. So it's secure and compliance. So it's all about making our workspace work for you and not the other way around. So with the workspace templates, so we can standardize recurrent business process into reusable templates, like, for example, project management or an onboarding template or even a marketing campaign. So by making them easy accessible to end users for repeatable efficiency process execution whenever necessary to create a new environment. That's why we have also powerful provisioning. And how we talk about new environments. Can you go to the powerful provisioning, please?
Sorry.
There you go, Peter. Thank you. And how we talk about new environments and how they can be created. So we can enable self-service workspace creation with built-in security, compliance, and governance, supporting approval workflows, sensitivity and retention labels, and prepare, of course, for Copilot-ready environments. Because boosts adoption in Microsoft 365 is one of those things that sounds simple, so get people to use it, but needs strategy, empathy, and good communication. So with Automate 365, we can reduce the IT dependency with self-service workspace creation. So we can prevent duplication and simplify navigation through proactive policy-driven controls, because governance in Microsoft 365 is a very important topic. So especially for organizations that we want to balance productivity and security without creating a chaotic environment. So we will summarize it clearly for you. So automate Microsoft 365 governance and IT workflows with custom provisioning and lifecycles policies. So we can apply tailored controls to templates, ensuring compliance, consistency, and of course, an operation efficiency. So the next one, and talking about health check and insight, so we need always a good overview and clear code-free view of our tenant environment with actionable reports. So we allow tracking usage, activity, and lifecycle trends, so identify issues and apply target solutions. So the last one that we have is regarding integration. So we need to know which systems can be use it within organization. That's why we have made available a large number of integrations that can be used with the provisioning engine with our Automate 365. So we can seamlessly integrate platforms like Salesforce, Jira, ServiceNow, EnterID, and more to ensure an unified and coordinate operations.
So Carlos, let's talk about that integration actually a bit more, because that was an area that you and I worked a fair bit on between our two products. So we talked about our client, vendor, and partner templates, but it's not just what your product needs to do. There's things that need to happen in our product, from an external user manager of setting the group up and enabling it for external sharing and things like that. I like where we landed, where what you built is that anytime, not just us, but any of our clients provision a template through your solution, you actually call out to our integration point to say, hey, a site just got created. It used this template. It was done by this person. It's for this client, yada, yada, yada. And then we can decide from there to say, okay, what's our custom piece that we need to do from here? And you're basically just calling a webhook on our side to say, hey, here's all the information about what just got set up. Now go do your piece. And we can use Logic App and build a workflow and do our customization from there. And it's working really well.
Yeah, exactly. So the automation piece is one of the new kid on the blocks. Sorry.
Yes.
That we have with Automate 365 that allow anyone that has an in-place process that can be called within the provisioning engine as well. So like Peter mentioned, so there is a Logic App behind the scenes that Envision IT did create to do some stuff. And our engine can do all the provisioning process. And at the end, okay, let's call that webhook for that Logic App to do the other work. So it's also one of the amazing features that we have available.
Cool. Thanks, Carlos. And then you ship with a whole bunch of pre-made templates, but obviously people can create their own templates as part of that process as well.
Yeah, exactly. So because everything that we did mention on the presentation, so everything it's up and running, and here is a visual of the look of our app where all the magic happens. So here any registered user with a valid license can use the functionality. So you can implement everything directly in the UI that we provide. There is no tricks behind the slaves that we have. So everything can be done within our BindTuning app. And all the automations and connections that needs to be done can be just used inside here.
Yeah, I've actually got your app open, signed in as me here in the browser. And this is the process that I went through to create those 3 client site, partner site, vendor site. So what we did is we just go through the standard SharePoint UI to build a team site the way we want. To say, hey, I want these folders, I want the break permissions here, I want these web parts on it, really building out this structure that we have here. And then we come into the BindTuning app and say, I want to create a template of that. We basically point it to that site collection that we've created. And we leave that one sort of as an empty, vanilla, generic template site collection and build out the template. And we can define things like, is there dynamic content that needs to come in? Some of our web parts needed some very particular configurations, like what's the group ID of the group that just got created. You were able to actually pass that information as part of the integration across, which was awesome. Sensitivity labels, I'm a big fan of, where you can actually define that in the template to say, hey, when we create a client or a partner site, we always want that to be amber labeled. It's the middle sensitivity. It requires MFA from our partner as part of that. And we just know that decision is not left up to the end user from that point of view. Policies around naming and blocked words, even approval workflows, I get to define all that as I'm building the template out through your tool. I can publish it, and then anybody in Envision IT can use that to create a new client site or to create a new partner site from there.
Yeah, exactly. So the template wizard. So I will not explain better than you, for sure, because you did explain.
We need Peter for our demos. So Peter, you're hired.
I don't know. You're pretty awesome, Carlos.
And, so you did explain everything that is needed. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So Beatrice, you've got an exciting offer that you wanted to put out to the webinar attendees here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very excited about the partnership with Envision IT, and for everyone in this session, we would like to give you it's a limited time offer, really. We are sharing, and I just shared a link if you want to start now, and you can also scan the QR code. So if you do it in the next 24 hours, you will get 3 months free access to Automate 365. so that you can start building your templates and you can start defining policies and guardrails and see how that can translate ultimately into improving the end user's experience, and making sure that your end users are able to self-serve for the workspaces they need, but while sticking to the guardrails that you define. So we hope you take this advantage and experience BindTuning. Anything you need, just let us know. I'll also share an email address that you can reach out, and I'm sure that in the end of this webinar, everyone will be contacted with some follow-up.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you didn't see it, it's in the chat in the meeting here. Beatrice shared out that link from that point of view. Just going to pause here for a second. I saw a question from John about 20 minutes ago about retention labels and folders and files. So Automate 365 will apply a sensitivity label. Does it also apply any sort of retention labels, or will it take what's part of the template itself?
Yes, yeah, is already available. So you were sharing the production environment, Peter, but since that you are an insider as well, so you already have access to our retention label functionality, which is already available in that, and very, very soon, in 2 weeks maximum, that will be available in production. So everything that relies on the label is that they are creating on the preview on the compliance portal for Microsoft. We can inherit that and apply to all the document libraries and lists that are a part of the site collection.
Now, Automate 365 can actually deploy a template to an existing site as well. I mean, it's got to work within the bounds of what's already there, but if you need to sort of apply some new web parts, put some new structure to it, that will work within boundaries as well, correct?
Yes, correct.
I mean, the one thing to remember with retention labels, John, on pre-existing, I mean, you can define default retention labels, but unfortunately that default doesn't apply to anything that's already existing in those document libraries. You need to write a little PowerShell or something to go through and update as part of that. So that's also something to think about as part of your migration. You know, I was focused more on the sensitivity, but yes, your retention structure is often an important part of that conversation too. So I want to take the last couple of minutes. We won't go too deep into this one. I was actually looking back. We did a webinar, actually 2 of them with NBN Canada, one of our clients. I think Patty from NBN Canada is actually on the webinar here, so welcome. NBN Canada is a not-for-profit that supports Canadian municipalities around performance measurement. So basically, support the municipalities collecting their own performance measures across 36 different service areas. They feed all that data into a data warehouse and then provide it back to municipalities themselves, to the board, and a subset of it actually to the general public as well. So people can compare and say, how is, you know, this municipality in Canada compared to this municipality on this particular service from that point of view? And how do we share best practices as part of that? So each of those service areas has what's called an expert panel associated with it. And also each municipality has its own Microsoft 365 group, which is where they do all their data collection as part of that. And it's a fairly involved process. You know, we've got a well-defined information architecture for them, but spinning up a new community or spinning up a new municipality is not a simple process. And in fact, Patty asked me for a quote recently to say, hey, we think we have 1 or 2 new municipalities that are going to be joining. What's the cost to set those up? And it wasn't insignificant. It was into, you know, the thousands of dollars of effort to kind of manually do that process, to say, hey, let's build a site, let's apply all the structure to it, the permissions, let's set up the documents, you know, the Excels that need to be there, the security matrix and permissions. There's actually a data warehouse and SQL stuff that needs to get done as part of that as well. We said, you know what, it wouldn't actually cost us much more than the cost to do one municipality to actually set up an automated process that you can do it yourself. And then by the time you're setting up your second one, it's basically for free from an ROI point of view. So I actually worked with BindTuning to say, hey, can we deploy Automate 365 into this? We can use that same integration that I was talking about with Carlos, where, you know, his webhook calls us and we can do some very specific things to say, hey, we're not just building this site structure, we're doing things in a data warehouse as part of that. We can build the workflow around all of that and actually make it a, you know, couple click process to say, hey, we're onboarding a new municipality. And if I come over to the NBN portal, I mean, these are all the different service areas. You can see they cover lots of different things from that perspective. If they were adding a new service area or they're adding a new municipality to the organization, that becomes self-service for them from that point of view. So a much nicer way to do that. I think we should probably do a refresher, since it's 2 years, kind of case study deep dive on NBN Canada, once we've got the full Automate 365 in there and things we're doing on that side. So stay tuned from a future event point of view. But we do have a whole bunch of other events coming up in the spring, mainly conferences. Going to be busy traveling, so heading to Vegas in a couple of weeks, the big M365 community conference. Jeff Teeper, who basically runs the SharePoint and Teams side of the business at Microsoft, big proponent of this conference, so we'll be down there for that. Heading to Europe for ECS in Dusseldorf, Power Platform Conference in Vienna, back across to Seattle for TechCon. We're doing a cybersecurity in London. So if you happen to be in any of these places, going to any of these conferences, let us know from that point of view. We haven't booked additional webinars. It's going to be pretty crazy with travel through May and June, but we should slot in something else before we break for the summer holidays. So with that, Beatrice, Carlos, thanks so much for joining. And
Peter,
for all
thanks
the
for
attendees,
having us.
thanks for
Thank
tuning
you.
in. Have a great
Thank
rest
you,
of your day.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.